Tonight, the explosive report that could be the most damaging yet for President Trump. And once again, this involves his former attorney and fixer, Michael Cohen. A former federal prosecutor joins us to discuss the significance. Then, former California Senator Barbara Boxer weighs in on that, the government shutdown, the 2020 race, and much more. Also, as the government shutdown drags on, the human toll, it is adding up. We're going to show you how widespread the impact is as well as the damage. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. We're going to start tonight with a report from Buzzfeed that is getting so much attention. Our senior political correspondent, Andrew Whitman, he joins us now with the very latest and also some background to provide some context. Andrew.
Oh, Rich, thanks very much. I'm going to start by quoting directly from Buzzfeed's report. They report President Donald Trump directed his longtime attorney, Michael Cohen, to lie to Congress about negotiations to build a Trump Tower in Moscow, according to two federal law enforcement officials involved in an investigation of the matter. It continues, Trump also supported a plan set up by Cohen to visit Russia during the presidential campaign in order to personally meet Vladimir Putin and jumpstart the tower negotiations. Make it happen, the sources said, Trump told Cohen. BuzzFeed also says Robert Mueller's office learned about all of this from multiple witnesses within the Trump organization, in addition to company emails, text messages, and other documents. The report also says Cohen confirmed all of this during interviews with Mueller's office. Trump attorney Rudy Giuliani says the report is, quote, categorically false. White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders agrees.
Did the president direct Michael Cohen to lie to Congress?
Look, that's absolutely ridiculous. I think that the president's outside counsel addressed this best and said in a statement earlier today that's categorically false.
But the report is already leading to a level of uproar in and around Washington we've only seen a handful of times through the already chaotic first 2 years of the Trump administration. Democrats already calling for hearings and investigations, with some noting that if true, not only would this be obstruction of justice, but that it would rise to the level of impeachment. And many now pointing to the words of Trump's own nominee for Attorney General.
If there was some reason to believe that the president tried to coach somebody not to testify or testify falsely, that could be obstruction of justice.
Yes, under that. Yeah, under an obstruction statute, yes.
You wrote on page 1 that a president persuading a person to commit perjury would be obstruction. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Or any person who persuades another to, yeah.
Okay. You also said that a president or any person convincing a witness to change testimony would be obstruction. Is that right?
Yes.
There is also talk that if the Cohen news, if true, could be the straw that breaks the camel's back when it comes to allegations against the Trump administration, potentially prompting shifts in public opinion, and even when it comes to Republicans defending this White House. It's already being compared to this moment in 1973, when former Deputy Assistant to President Nixon, Alexander Butterfield, broke the news that would eventually lead to an impeachment vote in the House and Nixon's resignation.
Mr. Butterfield, are you aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir.
Are you aware of any devices that were installed in the Executive Office building office of the President?
Yes, sir, at that time.
Were they installed at the same time?
They were installed at the same time.
The BuzzFeed story on Cohen's testimony comes as the White House is already struggling to put out another fire. Reports that the president confiscated notes from his interpreter after meeting one-on-one with Vladimir Putin. But that act, along with the Cohen testimony story, would seem to paint a pattern of Mr. Trump going to extraordinary lengths to cover up actions he's taken. And both are connected to the push to get Mr. Trump elected in the first place. The details on the Cohen story will come out at some point. We already have lots of details on the collecting of the notes, which is worth a review to see how it all fits together. This story begins on July 7th, 2017 in Hamburg, Germany, amid the backdrop of a G20 meeting of world leaders. This was the first time Trump and Putin met since Trump's election. The meeting was scheduled to last for 30 minutes. It went for more than 2 hours. The only people in the room, Trump and Putin, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and his Russian counterpart, and interpreters for both nations. Tillerson offered the only American summary of their meeting, and it was brief, saying it was, quote, a very robust and lengthy exchange on Russian interference in the 2016 election. But it wasn't until last weekend that we learned the president made sure there would be no record of what was discussed in the meeting. Specifically, as the Washington Post reported, Mr. Trump, quote, took possession of the notes of his own interpreter and instructed the linguist not to discuss what had transpired with other administration officials. But that's far from the only major development on July 7th, 2017. Earlier that day, the New York Times called the White House seeking comment on a bombshell report they were working on. That Times report is the one you're already very familiar with. The call was seeking comment on the Trump Tower meeting during the 2016 election. Inside Trump offices in Trump Tower, 3 key campaign officials met with a group of Russians. Those key campaign officials were Jared Kushner, Paul Manafort, and Donald Trump Jr. And with the White House now aware of the report the Times was working on, we got an unusual development back in Germany. As the G20 leaders gathered for dinner, President Trump was caught on camera making an unusual hand gesture to Vladimir Putin. And even though they had just met for more than 2 hours, the two men peeled off and talked again for another conversation. And this time the leaders spoke for more than an hour. Only a Russian interpreter was with them. No other American was within earshot. That meeting so unusual, people at the dinner described it as, quote, really weird, and that other world leaders were flummoxed, startled, and confused. Summing up the day in Hamburg, the Times called about a secret meeting with the Russians. Trump's response? To seek out and conduct another secret meeting with the Russians, this time the Russian president. We still don't know what Trump and Putin talked about, and we may never know. But we do know that the Times report was still on the president's mind as he boarded Air Force One back to Washington. The White House had not yet responded to the Times' request for comment on the Trump Tower meeting story, but the president did, during the flight, call Times reporter David Sanger. And this week, Sanger recalled the startling details of that conversation. Sanger says Trump told him, quote, Vladimir Putin told me that it couldn't have been the Russians who hacked into the Democratic National Committee because they're so good at cyber that they wouldn't have been caught. And Trump said he was really impressed by that argument. Sanger responded that the U.S. intelligence had already concluded that Putin had personally ordered those hacks, to which the president responded, quote, how could I possibly believe it? That came from former FBI Director James Comey. That came from former CIA Director John Brennan. That came from former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper. They're all, Trump said, political hacks. By the end of that flight and an unexpected delay on the tarmac back in Washington, the White House was ready with a statement for the Times on their Trump Tower meeting story. We now know several details about that statement. One, that it was dictated by President Trump himself. And two, that the statement drafted by the president was a lie. This was the statement labeling the Trump Tower meeting as being primarily about the adoption of Russian children and that nothing campaign-related was discussed. But that story did not hold long. And just 3 days later, Donald Trump Jr., facing mounting criticism of his own, tweeted out what he says were all of the emails related to the meetings between himself and British publicist Rob Goldstone, the emails that led to the Trump Tower meeting. To review, Goldstone wrote of a crown prosecutor of Russia with documents and information that would, quote, incriminate Hillary in her dealings with Russia and would be very useful to your father. That crown prosecutor turned out to be attorney Natalia Veselnitskaya, who was recently charged in an unrelated case that shows her close connection to the Kremlin. And of course, we cannot forget the response that Donald Trump Jr. sent back to Rob Goldstone, quote, if it's what you say, I love it, especially later in the summer. Perhaps the most concrete evidence of Trump campaign intent to collude with the Russian government in order to win the 2016 presidential election. Rich?
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. And joining us now, former federal prosecutor Roland Riopelle. Roland, even serious people have been saying things today since that Buzzfeed report. This could be more serious than Watergate. And I do all the caveats at the top. The reporter who said this did not personally see the evidence. He says he has multiple sources here. For this conversation, if the report is accurate and it's borne out in the final report, just how significant is this? And do you put this on the same level, if not even more so than Watergate?
If the report is accurate, then it is extremely serious. And I do think that the subornation of perjury, which is described in this newspaper report, is more serious than much of the conduct at issue in Watergate, because it involves suborning perjury not to cover up a simple political trick, political dirty trick, which is what happened in Watergate. It's the subornation of perjury, the solicitation of perjury, to cover up an illicit relationship with a foreign power that is our enemy. And that relationship was, of course, between Russia and Mr. Trump and the Trump campaign. And if that's what Mr. Cohen was asked to perjure himself about, that's a far more serious thing than Watergate. And it's a very serious crime. This will now be the second felony that Mr. Trump is directly implicated in. And this is indeed more serious than the campaign finance violation that he's an unnamed co-conspirator in.
And
so,
Roland, just
stuff.
so people, and I know we all the time hit him with a fire hose, seemingly daily of allegations. This isn't just, not that I want to minimize perjury, but this is a crime. This isn't anything on the margins. It's that serious.
Oh, yeah. You're asking somebody to go before Congress, raise their right hand, swear to tell the truth, and lie to cover up your relationship with Russia. That is very, very serious. And, it sounds like there's just loads of proof of it in terms of emails, text messages, and the like. And if it's a rock-solid case, like it sounds like, this is bad news for Mr. Trump.
Roland, I'll be joined shortly by former Senator Barbara Boxer. And the questions I'm hearing today on the Hill is, can they wait for the Mueller report here before they start asking serious questions, basically doing their job as the second branch, as check and balance on the White House? How does that get navigated? And if asked, should they wait until the report is done and finished at the risk of politicization? Should they get involved now? I mean, you have a sitting president, we have a shutdown, and all the other moving parts that go along with this. Can they afford to wait?
You know, they have got Mr. Cohen's testimony scheduled for early February, and that's really pretty quick by the standards of Capitol Hill. And we've speculated very recently that the timing of that testimony probably indicates that Mr. Mueller's report may be coming out about then anyway. They certainly can call Mr. Cohen to testify at any time. He's done with the legal system, so there's no downside risk of calling him and immunizing him if you have to. And there are a number of other witnesses that they could get started with, like Mr. Papadopoulos and the other witnesses who are done with the legal system. I don't see any reason for Congress to wait much more than it has. I think they can start without waiting for the Mueller report, as long as they coordinate their hearings with Mr. Mueller so that they're not stepping on his toes.
You know, Roland, it's interesting. We played a couple clips in the wind-up to this of the confirmation hearings for Mr. Barr. And with Lindsey Graham and Senator Klobuchar, the two of them, they asked direct questions, which were theoretical at the time, but what if the White House and the president were directly to have basically suborned perjury? And you have Barr on the record as saying, oh, those definitely cross over the threshold here. Whether that was just a lot of foresight or whatever the reasoning is the in all likelihood next Attorney General almost in a box now where Trump can't look to him to make this go away? He's already said that this is, in effect, a high crime and a misdemeanor.
Oh yes. And Mr. Barr was in a box whether or not that question was ever asked. The subornation of perjury is something that was one of the articles of impeachment for Bill Clinton, and it was one of the articles of impeachment for Richard Nixon. So there's very clear precedent for impeaching a president if he solicits perjury from a witness before Congress. And Mr. Barr, whether he gave that answer or not, would be boxed in by that precedent.
Finally, Mr. Trump was not the only person mentioned in this report. Family member or members were also reportedly privy to the directive or to the conversations regarding suborning perjury for Mr. Cohen to lie when under oath. We've talked about this a lot over the course of this investigation. If this extends to family as well, a whole host of other potential conversations could be in the offing.
Oh yes, oh yes, and you know, family members could be charged with being aiders and abettors of Mr. Cohen's perjury. Indeed, I suspect you'll remember that Hope Hicks resigned very suddenly at one point after being interviewed by Mr. Mueller. I suspect that was a result of him confronting her with emails or text messages that put her into the mix somehow in this situation. And, you know, she saw the handwriting on the wall and decided she'd better flee the White House because it's on fire. I think that's the kind of thing that explains these abrupt departures.
And the departures not just limited, as you said, to Ms. Hicks. Also, there was even attorneys at the time who left after, right around the time of the Russia Tower meetings and some of these conversations as well. As they say, this will all come out in the wash. But fair to say, Roland, before I let you go, today could be one of those seismic days here, or the most significant one we've had to this point, about just how serious the hot water in that the president finds himself.
Yes, I think that's absolutely accurate, Richard. I think this was another one of those days where it looks like Mr. Trump has taken a serious hit below the waterline, and there's trouble at the White House, no question.
Roland Riopelle, as always, thank you, my friend. I appreciate it.
Pleasure to be with you, Richard.
Now, when we come back next, what I think will be a fascinating perspective on this. Former California Senator Barbara Boxer, she joins us to weigh in on not just the Buzzfeed report, the Democratic reaction to it, but also Washington today. Stay with us.